Good morning and welcome as we continue, as we complete this series on bridges today. This is the last of this series, and today's is entitled No Bridge Needed. And our scripture is Matthew 14, verses 22 through 33, and you will recognize this scenario once I start reading. Right then, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowds. When he sent them away, he went up onto the mountain by himself to pray. Evening came and he was alone. Meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by the waves and was already far away from land. Very early in the morning, he came to his disciples walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." They were so frightened they screamed. Just then Jesus spoke to them. "Be encouraged, it's me. Don't be afraid." Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened. As he began to sink, he shouted, "Lord, rescue me." Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" When they got into the boat, the wind settled down. Then those in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's Son." The Upper Room created a film called In Remembrance, and it deals with the Passover feast and the celebration of communion. There's one scene in this where Peter and James and John, I think Peter and John, as I recall, sort of get into it with each other about who has the right position or the position of honor with Jesus. And they're going back and forth, and finally Jesus takes his cup and he just bangs it on the table to get everybody's attention and just to let everybody know, hey, this is out of order here. And then the scene goes back to Peter's face, and he mutters sort of under his breath that others couldn't hear, but Jesus heard, "But I'm the only one that walked on water." That's Peter's ego there. And every time I get the communion passage or this, I think of that scene and Jesus rolling his eyes at Peter's response. But that's a little off the subject there. The scene here, that what's preceded in Matthew is important. The chapters that precede this are the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew has consolidated all of the teaching ministry of Christ into a consolidated segment of his gospel. And we refer to that as the Sermon on the Mount because the scripture says that the people had gathered on the mountainside. And he got them to sit down and began to teach them. In all likelihood, what Matthew has done is compiled a group of Jesus' teachings into one segment in his gospel. But the result of this teaching and why Jesus acts the way he does, that's irrelevant to how Matthew has composed his gospel here. The scene immediately before this is that Jesus has given them the miracle of feeding of the 5,000. The people are there, there's no food available, and the disciples want Jesus to send the people away, and Jesus says, "No, get them to sit down," and then he says, "You feed them." And then he blesses the loaves and the fish that the boy has, and they feed all of the 5,000 men and the women and children that are with them with 12 baskets left over. In the aftermath of that, the people are excited, and the political situation in Palestine was very unstable, much like it is today. And there was a fear on Jesus's part that the people were going to try to elevate him to king. And then a civil war would break out with people fighting to defend him as king. And that's not who Jesus was. So he sends his disciples away, tells them to go across the lake. In other words, get out of this situation, get away from here. And then he dismisses the people, and then he goes alone further up the mountain to pray during the night. That's the setting of the scene here. And then during the night, the wind comes up on the lake. The Sea of Galilee, an inland sea below sea level, storms were frequent, springing up. You have a lot of unstable air, heating and cooling that makes for these storms, and the wind in particular to come up. William Barclay, in his translation, uses the word contrary. The wind was contrary, where the more modern translations just talk about a strong wind. But as you go on, in verses 25 and 26, you have the references to Jesus walking on water. In verse 25, walking on the lake, and then verses 26, also in the Common English Bible, walking on the lake. In the Greek, there are two different phrases that are used in verse 25 and 26 with two different meanings. In verse 25, it could mean either over the sea or towards the sea. In verse 26, it's on the sea. And so the scholars have debated this back and forth, and they've come up with two competing theories as to what this event actually was. One is the miracle of Jesus walking on the water. The other is that they do some interpreting that the wind had driven the boat from far out at sea to the northern shore, and that Jesus, seeing them in distress, has gone to where they're being battered along the shore, and what they see is Jesus walking through the surf. Now, that's all well and good that you could have that interpretation. But then when you get to the next verses, in verse 28, Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. And then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water towards Jesus. If they're in the surf, that doesn't track, at least not in my mind. And so I think the scholars are being a little bit more nitpicky than they should when they try to interpret the Greek there two different ways, when it seems clear that something miraculous has happened here. Peter, his personality is one that he's impulsive. He acts without thinking. If a thought comes into his mind, words come out of his mouth. If the thought comes into his mind, there's action as a result of it. And so he doesn't even think about that there's a miracle going on here. He just simply says, Lord, if you say so, I'll come out there and join you. In other words, he wants to be with Jesus. He's not thinking about that getting out of the boat, that he's going to have to walk on the water to get to Jesus. It's only after he gets out of the boat and starts toward Jesus that he becomes aware of the wind and the waves around him. And once he becomes aware of that, he realizes this just isn't possible, logically, that this isn't possible for me to be doing this. And immediately he starts to sink in the water. And The next words out of his mouth are, "Lord, rescue me. I've messed up here. I need your help. Bail me out again." And so Jesus says, "Take my hand." And he takes his hand, and together they get back into the boat. It's also interesting to me that it's only when they're back in the boat that the wind abates. The wind is still whipping around while Jesus is coming to them, tossing the boat around, but it's only after he gets in the boat with them that the calmness comes over. Now there's some theology here, at least I see some theology here, that Jesus is always there in the rough times when the wind is blowing. The word that Barclay used, contrary, I think that word helps to focus in our minds the fact that in living life there are opposing forces that we deal with. I remember visiting a man once who was recovering from some surgery, and I was making this visit for another pastor. I did not know this man or his circumstances, and I just trying to make a conversation with him, just ask him, how's it going? How's the day going? And he looked at me with very serious look on his face, and he just said, "Living is hard." I can't imagine what he was going through. I later learned that he was dealing with cancer, and just in living our lives, it's hard. There's no other way to put it. When you live your life, it's hard, and when you try to live it as a follower of Christ, there are opposing forces, contrary winds that we have to deal with. And Jesus is showing us here that when we have faith, when we're willing to trust, and I'll use the word impulsive here, when we're willing to act rather than thinking it through to death, just in response to an invitation from Christ, when that's the word I'm looking for, respond to what Christ is calling us to do, what he is inviting us to do, that we're not alone. There may be contrary winds, but he's going to be there beside us, and when we start to sink, his hand's going to reach out and hold on. We have a lifeline to hold on to. And then the section concludes in verse 31 with, says, "Those in the boat, that being the disciples, worshiped Jesus and said, 'You must be God's Son.' They had eyes to see and to understand on some level that this man Jesus, who they had been spending time with, they had given up parts of their lives to be with and to follow, and who was teaching them, that there was a relationship with God that was beyond anything that they had experienced humanly in human relationships before there. What about contrary winds or strong winds? We've had some wind over the last couple of days.
What about them?
Huh?
What about them?
Well, what about the concept of contrary winds in the living of your life? Being up against those from time to time. Do you think about that, or are we to a point in our faith where we're comfortable with that presence of Christ? That assurance that we're not alone? Obviously, the disciples weren't at that place when this was taking place. Of course, this is before the crucifixion, before the resurrection. they're still learning in their faith there.
I think we all have. You can trust Jesus to be with you all the time, but it's still necessary when you have a wind that you have to call on him to help you. I think that's like acknowledging that he's there, you know?
Your calling is an acknowledgement that he's there.
Right.
And to me, the contrary winds is something out the ordinary. You have your everyday life, but you might have a death of a loved one. That's out of the ordinary. It only happens one time. Or you might have an accident and somebody gets really hurt seriously. That could happen again, but at that time, that's the only thing you're focusing on at the time is that person getting well or what you can do to help them. Same way with a death of a family member or a close friend. You're dealing with, trying to help people that's associated with that, to help them through it as well as help yourself through it. And to help yourself through it is through helping others through it. And that's how you grow. That bond with other people and with Christ and God is the way you can develop more spiritually or more compassionately. I know when we have our grandchild, you're more concerned about making sure that they're taken care of it while you're taking care of them, because you've accepted responsibility for that day, that weekend, that week, or that short time that you have them before they go back to the parents. So that's a little bit of a contrary wind. It's a happy contrary wind, but your own, like pins and needles, well, they might get outside and fall off a swing and get hurt, fall off a bicycle, skin up the knees, all this kind of stuff. But in death of a family member or something that's more extreme, or an accident in a car. We have a neighbor now, she's gone to the hospital 3 times in 3 or 4 weeks. And this past time she's still in the hospital now, 5 days later. And we haven't heard exactly what's going on. The first time we found out she had a UTI, urinary tract infection, which was causing a lot of dementia type reactions and adverse things that our husband and son and families, and they haven't dealt with that with a family member before, and then they're having to deal with it. So that's a contrary wind to them and for our neighbors, because we're all concerned as to how can we help him deal with that situation and all that kind of thing. But it's that, to me, that's the contrary wind. It's something so far out of the ordinary. It's like a life changing experience that might come once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
Or once a year.
Pastor Don has entitled this last session, "No Bridge Needed." And we never talked to, so I'd never know what exactly track she's taking on these until I hear her sermon later on today with the rest of you. But it seems to me that one possible track that she could take here is that through our faith as a disciple of Jesus Christ, we've accepted the invitation of Christ to be a part of his life. And in accepting that invitation, there's not anything needed in our relationship with Christ and God. No intermediary is what I'm trying to say. The high priest that the Jews sought to be their intermediary to communicate between them and God, we have that in the presence of Christ in our lives. So there's not any bridge that's needed to get us or to bridge us to something else or somebody else. That bridge has been given to us in the person of Jesus Christ. Well, we'll see where Pastor Dawn is going as we end this series. The next series that we go through the month of October with is Heroes of the Faith. And we'll be exploring some of those in Scripture in the coming weeks. So may God's blessings be upon you.